Let's get to our top story, which is we are watching a full-scale war about to unfold between NATO and Russia. Forget Ukraine for a moment here as a major player in any of this, right? They are pawns in NATO's game. Frankly, they've been pawns from the very beginning, right? For 8 long years, they've been pawns in NATO's plans. You install a puppet government in Ukraine and you run them into the ground. That's what NATO does, right? Today, we saw a major speech by Russian President Vladimir Putin calling a spade a spade. And I think for a lot of people in the West who'd never actually heard the president of Russia, like, if they played these, I mean, the BBC kind of played some of this today. CNN played little clips here and there, but for the most part, Western mainstream media ignored this speech. They played, or they talked about the highlights, but they didn't play it in context at all.
Oh, they played it. They talked about it and said, basically, Putin has threatened the whole world. We are all in trouble because he has elevated the rhetoric around nuclear war. We're going to break down that piece.
Yeah.
But even I was driving and I heard it in Portuguese on the radio.
But it was interesting, the way that they focused, zeroed in on that particular part of it. And I think for a lot
that is really it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really it. That's the one piece that they played. But they didn't contextualize and talk about the Donbass. They didn't talk about Putin's laid out a history lesson for people, basically on how that area has been shelled for the last 8 years. He called it a genocide. We've been covering that here on the show. We've had excellent journalists and coverage of that for a very long time on this show, right? But for a lot of people in the West, this might have been the first time they're hearing about it, and they're like, that's garbage. That's total Russian propaganda, you know? Anyway, let's get to it. So he spent the top of the speech, I think, really talking about the territorial integrity of Russia as a nation. And I just want you to, when you're listening to this speech, think about your country, wherever you are in the world, right? You're in Norway, you're in Sweden, you're in the United States. I want you to really think about the United States for a second here. What would the United States do if suddenly a Chinese, Russian organization like NATO started invading and basically setting up puppet governments in Mexico and Puerto Rico and Cuba and Canada and, Greenland, basically surrounding the United States of America? What do you think the U.S. would do? Would it ever allow it?
More than that. And let's say taking over a territory that was American and harming the people who were left there.
Right.
That is a bigger piece than just the territorial piece.
That's a good piece. Yeah, that's a good point. So territorial integrity, though, was the main sort of focus at the top of the speech. And he provided some history on how the people of the Donbass region, of course, have been attacked brutally since 2014. They've been
and I want to point out really quick too that, like, there's data to back up the history that he's giving where there's not a lot of data to back up the U.S. narrative. So it's like he has history and facts on his side.
Yeah, I mean, because we're going to play the Biden side of this a little bit later, and it's hilarious. I was sitting there watching Biden's speech in front of the UN, and I was like, he's literally saying this out loud, and he's lying. He's lying in front of the UN Security Council. I mean, it was really embarrassing. Like, if you're an American watching that, you got to be embarrassed.
Yes. I don't want it to seem like we're championing one side or the other. I feel like watching this speech makes me very scared because I do not think he's bluffing. I do think that he has told us what he's been up to, Putin, what he will do, the lengths he will go to defend Russia. And I feel like, I'm not sitting here thinking like, oh, you go on with your bad self, right? This is scary for everybody, and it's incumbent upon us all to take it seriously. And I don't think that the Western narrative has even tried to take it seriously, not even tried.
No, and if you start with the idea that, hey, for 8 years, that tens of thousands of people have been killed on a regular basis in the Donbass, like that's been unfolding for years with no Western coverage, zero. Like, we should all take that seriously, right?
Yeah.
So if we start with that premise, let's play the beginning of this. This is where he talks specifically about the historical context of genocide in the Donbass. Now, I want to be very clear about something. Natalie and I've watched the speech multiple times. I took the English version of the sound bites and I compared them word for word with the transcript from the Russian president's website. So the transcript is virtually spot on, except for like a little thes or this, like some minor little words. Everything is spot on, and I compared it to the official transcript from the Russian president's website based on the English translation. So just so you know, you're not getting some weird version of the speech. It's pretty much spot on. So listen to the genocide piece.
At bridge, and they turned Ukrainian people into cannon fodder, and they pushed them to start the war against our country. They started this war back in 2014. They were using armed forces against civilians. They organized genocide and terror against the people who refused to recognize the power that came to power in Ukraine as a result of coup d'etat. And after today's Kyiv regime basically publicly refused to resolve the issue Donbass peacefully, and they started talking about their willingness to have nuclear weapons, it became absolutely clear that the large-scale assault in Donbass, like it happened 2 times before, is inevitable.
Yeah. So it is inevitable, right? That this was basically, as I saw people in the chat saying, you've been pushing the bear for how long? And they'd been asking for help for many, many years. But
well, historically, what he's referring to is in 2014, this region did not want to join Ukraine. They fought against it, and Ukrainian forces fired upon them. Civilians, right? And they have been harming them for years because they did not want to recognize this area as Ukrainian. This is true. Even if you read history, I read a history book about Ukraine recently called Borderland, and the woman who wrote it is pro-Ukraine, anti-Russia. And she is very clear about how the Donbass regions and the Luhansk regions had fought against joining. They did not want this. Even someone who is pro-Ukraine admits this. The history is clear. These people have been harmed by Ukraine for a long time.
Yeah, if you think of the Donbass as the whole region, right, and you think of the individual areas that are going to have these referenda votes this weekend, but isn't it still amazing? I'm always amazed by how all of these other countries but the United States actually hold votes on the weekends when people don't have to work. Like, why is the United States still holding elections on a Tuesday?
Right.
I mean, it's amazing to me. Anyway, so you have Donbass, overseeing everything, and then you have the Zaporizhia, you have Lugansk, you have Luhansk, you have Donetsk. All of them, of course, going to vote this weekend. And but one thing Putin talked about in all of this was the peace talks that have been unfolding. That they were in the process of peace talks. And
we knew about this. We reported when they met in Istanbul, and he references it in this next clip. He says, we met in Turkey. Those peace talks went well until enter Western influence.
And here is what I want to say publicly for the first time after the beginning of the special military operation, including during the talks in Istanbul. The Kyiv representatives reacted to our suggestions and proposals quite positively, and we talked about guaranteeing security of Russia and guaranteeing its interests, but it was obvious that the West was not happy with the peaceful resolution. So after the compromise was reached, Kyiv was directly instructed to undermine all the agreements. More weapons were pumped into Ukraine. The Kyiv regime used new gangs of mercenaries and neo-Nazis. And the units trained by the NATO standard and led by the Western instructors joined the fight.
Yeah. So it pushed them back, and then suddenly we know that the Zelensky regime, of course, then allowed prisoners out to start to join the fight, mercenaries, armed of those individuals, and of course the neo-Nazis were a major part of that military operation. In fact, we know that all of this is true. We know that this is true because Boris Johnson was the NATO leader on stopping any of this, any peace talks. Here's Zero Hedge writing this afternoon, Boris Johnson's excellent adventure, they write. We should recall that only a few months ago, Henry Kissinger warned the collective West to stand down and avoid this conflict, even at the price of ceding Ukraine's territory. But his warnings fell on deaf ears. That was in late May. In fact, in April and July of this year, negotiated settlement of the Ukraine crisis was being seriously discussed between Kiev and Moscow. But on both occasions, Boris Johnson intervened to torpedo the negotiations and abruptly flew to Kiev to persuade Ukraine's President Zelensky to end the talks. That happened twice.
Yes, and we've seen a parade of Western leaders from the United States there as well. Chuck Schumer What's he doing there, right? Nancy Pelosi,
Mitch McConnell.
Why are elected representatives in Ukraine, right, when they could just pick up the phone?
Right. Anthony Blinken going there. You're not pushing for peace. You're not pushing for peace.
And Merrick Garland, which didn't make any sense for him to go.
Right. The U.S. Attorney General. What the hell is he doing?
I forgot
why
about
did
that.
he go?
Yeah. You want to talk about the refugee piece of this?
Yes, he talks about how more than 7 million people had to leave that region. We talked about it recently. Why don't those people just leave? Well, a lot of them have, but he still feels like he cannot leave behind the many who have not or were not able to because of how they still have to live. Listen.
More than 7.5 million people used to leave. Many of them had to become refugees to leave their homes. And those who stayed, I'm talking about some 5 million people, they have to leave under constant shelling and rocket attacks against neo-Nazi gangs. They are carrying out terrorist attacks against civilians.
Okay, so it's a little hard to distinguish the accent when he says live and leave. He's talking about many who had to leave, but the 4 or 5 million who are left have to live under this constant horror. And he says that, in Russia, they feel like it is not their right to leave these people living in this condition. Listen.
And we have no right to leave people who are close to us to these tortures. We have to listen to their call, who they want to determine their own future, their own fate. The parliament of the Lugansk and Donetsk republics and administration of the Zaporozhye and Kherson regions made a decision about carrying out referenda about the future of these regions, and they appealed to us, to Russia, to support this decision. I would like to emphasize we will do everything to provide safe conditions to hold the referenda so that they could express their will and make the decision about their future, and the decision that will be made by the majority of the people of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, of the Kherson and Zaporozhye regions. We will support this decision.
Larry Johnson, for ex-CIA analyst, this morning commenting specifically on that strategy, and he said this was been planned for weeks, that this removal of troops was all part of the plan to allow these referenda votes to come to fruition. It unfolded over the past few weeks. So, in the Western media, everyone's like, oh, this just popped up 2 days ago. This started happening. No, this has been in the works for weeks. And I think the broader argument here really is that this also really crushes NATO, absolutely crushes NATO, because if they become part of the Russian Federation, what appetite will NATO and the United States, American voters, European voters have to actually now go into technically sovereign Russian territory and start a war? This is like a major blow to NATO.
And it pokes holes in this narrative that when people vote for their own sovereignty, America holds her freedoms, right? Or holds her principles, that these are our principles, sovereignty and freedom and democracy. Well, then if we see that in place and we do not recognize this vote, which already the United States and Western leaders are setting themselves up to say they don't recognize the vote, which is why President Putin had to say here, we have to secure these elections, make sure that people are safe going to a poll, right? And these are the concerns. It's not just the international deeming of legitimacy, but also just the safety of it.
And Philip, I want to play this clip from Nebojsa Malik. He's a journalist, an American journalist, because it makes sense in context here. There's been a lot of bluster in the West about these referenda votes, right? The West saying they'll never recognize the Donbass as part of Russia, the Russian Federation. Okay, so who cares? And as I mentioned, Larry Johnson said this has been planned for weeks, but American journalist Nebojsa Malik talked about these votes and says it doesn't really matter what the West thinks at all. Listen to what he says about this.
The entire so-called international community, which is what basically the U.S. and its allies like to call themselves, completely missed the memo since February that the whole point of the special military operation and whatever it is about to become with these referenda is that nobody should care what they think anymore. I think that was the message from Moscow, that some people got it loud and clear, and others just completely missed it. I don't think Russia cares if the West recognizes this. They're following their own laws. They're following international law as written, and they're insisting that they can interpret it just as well as anybody, the England or France or the U.S. or Germany, probably even better. And I think that's, it's one of those, Olaf Scholz or Guterres or Ursula von der Leyen, they all think that, their vote matters in this situation, and it really doesn't.
If that's the case, right, what if we do see that the election comes out that this region votes to join Russia, that happens, and then they lay down their weapons and just secure their border? Then what? Then the war's over? Then all the air goes out of the Western military machine?
Yeah, well, then they have China to pay attention to.
Okay. Then we'll move on.
Because as Chinese President Xi Jinping said today, China now needs to focus on a real war, real military conflict, and not just like drills. So get ready for that.
I feel like that's kind of, I feel like that's kind of like they kind of knew that this wasn't going to last long, I feel. And that's why they started focusing on Taiwan. Because if you watch the news, like where they were doing that demonstration, like here's the war, like they played the game, the war game, like they were setting that up ahead of time because I think they knew that this was going to fall apart pretty quick.
This was just the test ground, right? This was just this was the staging ground for what's going to come with China. Meanwhile, Putin is not. And the story, I think that the part of the speech that got the most attention, and I think largely taken out of context, was when Putin talked about nuclear blackmail by Western countries. They zeroed in on the part where he basically said he would use any weapons necessary to defend his sovereign territory. I'm not bluffing. That was the focus of most of the Western media's coverage of this. But they missed the beginning piece of the context here, which is about what Western countries have been doing around nuclear blackmail. So let's play the whole clip like you won't see on CNN. Watch.
They should rob our country of everything. They have started nuclear blackmail. I'm not only talking about the attacks against Zaporozhye nuclear power station that is promoted by the Western curators, but I'm talking about the statements about high-level representatives of the NATO countries about the possibility of using weapons of mass destruction against Russia, nuclear weapons. And those who make such statements against Russia, I would like to remind them that our country also possesses various type of strike weapons. And in some components, we have more modern weapons than NATO countries. And if the territorial integrity of our country is threatened, to defend and protect our country and our people, we will use all the means that we have. And I'm not bluffing.
So that's what they zeroed in on, the I'm not bluffing part of this.
That's like the, remember Tombstone, where he's like, telling Wyatt, he's like, I'm going to make your head into a canoe. And the guy's like, he's not bluffing. It's like, don't do it. He's being serious. And Putin's, he's not bluffing. He warned us for 8 years. The guy is not bluffing.
Oh, I don't think that I ever thought that he was bluffing. Although I do want to make this kind of silly observation that if he's saying our weapons are more sophisticated than yours, I wouldn't have sat in front of those old phones while I was making that.
I noticed that too earlier this afternoon.
I noticed, why didn't they move those phones? Don't they have higher tech phones?
Like those two, and maybe that's modern. Maybe that's smarter, having the old tech, right? The old analog. They're hack-proof old analog. And by the way, it's like a yellowing plasticky phone.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and then you kind of have to wonder when he says they have more modern weapons, if he means modern, like just beyond that. Like, is he thinking those phones are modern? Like,
I don't think so.
I don't know. We did have the Air Force. I mean, we literally had Space Force and Air Force. We had a high-up member of the military admitting this week that the Air Force and Space Force are using weapons that are historic. Literally, historic was the word that they used. So we've seen it on the battlefield, like these NATO weapons being destroyed. But not as bad maybe as these phones. I don't know.
Well, and a lot of people are saying that Philip, you say something. Go ahead.
Oh, no, sorry. I was just going to say, like, so when you're saying historic, do they mean unprecedented or do they mean like antiquated?
Antiquated. Like antiquated. Like,
oh, okay.
Straight out of the history books. Like, wow, look at these old weapons that the Air Force is using. Like, wow, I'm glad we're spending $800 billion a year to make sure we have the most modern weapons in the world.
Like anachronistic. They don't belong of this era.
Yeah,
like roaring in like a dirigible or something like that.
Yes, yeah. There's a blimp up there. So I want to the final soundbite I want to play from Putin, and then I want to play some of this Biden response here, where he basically says that the West has crossed the line. Like this is the end of it. Then the West has absolutely crossed the line. Listen, and we'll look at the phones.
In their aggressive anti-Russian policies, the West has crossed the line. We keep hearing threats against our country, against our people. Certain irresponsible politicians from the West, they don't just say about their plans to supply long-range assault weapons to Ukraine, systems that would allow them to strike Crimea and other regions of Russia. Such terrorist attacks, including using the Western weapons, are also used against the Belgorod.
Yeah, so Belgrade and another in Kursk as well, like were also hit recently. So using these longer range weapons, we've been reporting it here on the show. And people in the chat are saying, yeah, those old phones, those are safer because they're analog. It's basically like, in many ways hack proof, right? That's why you go back to a landline.
Okay,
right?
fine. I want to discuss this rhetoric in the West now that they're saying that Putin has elevated the nuclear discussion, right? That russia fire first, right, in a conventional war if the very existence of the state is threatened. He says that, right? If we think the integrity of our state is threatened, we will fire first.
And by the way,
that is not an escalation. That is actually literally what Russia updated when they updated their nuclear doctrine in 2010. That is literally what he said. He's reiterating what we already knew it was.
By the way, President Biden just recently said this. Like if our sovereignty was, by the way, Liz Truss, not that we're like championing these people by name, but Liz Truss just said that she just got elected prime minister, right? She just said that.
Yeah.
And the audience, we played the clip here. The audience went crazy for it. They're like, yeah, you'd use nuclear weapons. Go. So she's like, yeah, if we had to protect our sovereignty, and the people of Britain clapped for it.
Yeah. In 2010, when Russia released its updated nuclear doctrine, it seemed as if this was a move to make it clear that Russia didn't have any ill will towards China, that any nuclear policy was more aimed towards the West. And in fact, in 2018, Putin said in this interview, he said, any use of nuclear weapons against Russia or its allies, weapons of short, medium, or any range at all, will be considered as a nuclear attack on this country. Retaliation will be immediate with all the attendant consequences. So again, this was 2018. This is not new. We knew this if we'd been following their policy.
We have 23,000 people watching us live right now. That's more than CNN gets. Please hit that like button, and that'll push us further out in the algorithm. President Biden this morning rewrote his entire speech. Well, he didn't write it. He doesn't write anything. He's lucky if he can even write his own name at this point. But his speechwriter rewrote the whole speech this morning because of what Putin had to say. He was going to be speaking at the United Nations today, speaking in front of the United Nations Security Council. He came right out swinging, reading off of these prepared notes, and right away started repeating a number of falsehoods about an unprovoked attack on the part of Russia. Watch.
A war chosen by one man, to be very blunt. Let us speak plainly. A permanent member of the United Nations Security Council invaded its neighbor, attempted to erase a sovereign state from the map. Russia has shamelessly violated the core tenets of the United Nations Charter. No more important than the clear prohibition against countries taking the territory of their neighbor by force.
Okay. Can I, Philip, can you pull up the Aaron Mate tweet just if you can here? We'll get to the other sound bites here in a second. But so it was a very artful way that he just explained taking the territory. So Aaron Mate tweets, the U.S. is occupying a third of Syria right now. So invoking the UN charter is kind of awkward, but White House speechwriters are crafty. They got around it by getting Biden to say that countries cannot take territory of their neighbors by force. Syria isn't a U.S. neighbor, so we're good.
All good then.
That's a good, very Aaron Mate. That's why we love him. But again, coming out saying that this was something totally dreamt up in Putin's head, like the like that Herman's Head show from the 1990s or whatever it was, where
Right.
like he just
woke up one day and thought, I'll start a war.
I'm going to start a war. Like, I have no other reason. There couldn't be any other reason.
I am unprovoked, but feel like provoking something. I want to be starting something.
I am totally unprovoked right now. Can I go start a war?
You're going to be starting something.
I'm going to start this war. I'm totally unprovoked.
You guys, I'm starting to feel a little bit unprovoked myself right now.
Okay. All right.
I'll provoke you. So then he went on to say that Putin's goal all along is to increase. He talked about Putin's goal, like the whole idea behind Putin's strategy. And what we just heard from Putin a few minutes ago, it seems like it's the exact opposite of what President Biden, someone in the chat says Clayton meant to say Resident Biden. I agree with you on that. I really don't think there's anybody left up there. And I really, it's the deep state running this entire show in Washington. So yes, the Resident Biden basically said Putin's goal is this. Watch.
This world should see these outrageous acts for what they are. Putin claims he had to act because Russia was threatened. But no one threatened Russia. And no one other than Russia sought conflict.
I mean, that's a bald-faced lie. I know we try to. Is it a bold-faced, bald-faced? I don't care. It's a lie. It's a flat lie.
Yes.
I mean, you're
propaganda.
lying.
It's propaganda that he thinks will win support of whatever it is the West wants. And it's really uncomfortable to watch that because you know that many people who just won't read a book, who won't follow the history of something that's more than maybe 4 months old, will just be like, oh, yeah,
Who
that
don't watch
seems
independent
pretty bad.
media.
No, I see people today on Twitter who literally have like a Ukrainian flag in their bio, in their handle. They watch CNN, and they're like, thank you, President Biden, for calling out this. It's amazing, like the lies, and people believe this stuff.
Yeah.
And what's upsetting about it is it's just demonstrably false. It's easily provable with just a little bit of journalism. It's easy to prove that he's lying. Really upsetting. Then he went on to talk about imperial power. This part made me laugh out loud and fell out of my chair. Watch.
The United States is also working closely with our allies and partners to impose costs on Russia, to deter attacks against NATO territory, to hold Russia accountable for the atrocities and war crimes. Because if nations can pursue their imperial ambitions without consequences, then we put at risk everything this very institution stands for. Everything.
Yeah, we will not stand for imperial powers invading other countries willy-nilly. We won't do it. That's what the UN stands for. I'm saying to you as the President of the United States, which is actively invaded 8-9 countries right now.
At the moment.
We're in Syria. We're in Yemen. We're in Ukraine.
We'd
Why?
like to be in Taiwan.
We are in Taiwan. Like, we've got thousands of troops in Taiwan. Where else are we right now? I mean, Somalia. Can you name the list? Keeps
Whatever.
going.
We're not in Ukraine, though. We're not in Ukraine.
Oh, right.
Right.
Yeah, we don't know. No one's there. U.S. has nothing to do with
Well,
it.
actually, we didn't play this part, but you can seek it out yourself if you'd like. In the entire Putin speech, he talks about how NATO forces and contractors are in Ukraine, and he knows it. He calls them out. He says, well, we, know we're fighting Ukraine, but we also know who is behind this. So clearly he's not stupid.
Zelensky had a response this afternoon. The president of Ukraine, sources close to Zelensky claim that Zelensky is not afraid of Putin's threats and will continue the military campaign. The office of the president will use the referendums to obtain new weapons from the West, primarily air defense weapons and tanks. So now this is an opportunity for them to get the tanks that the West said they were not going to send. They'll be able to get jets that the West said they were not going to send. That should help their armed forces, he says, of Ukraine in the counteroffensive in the south part of Ukraine. So that is the Zelensky response. He also appeared with Bill Clinton today at the Clinton Global Initiative. He zoomed in to ask for more money from the West and said one thing that the West can do is to provide, sort of endless supply of weapons.
More.
And that he said basically when you supply us with weapons, that means that we get to spread democracy. Like the United States then gets to spread democracy.
Great.
So that was the Zelensky
Well, then where's all the
response.
video of these weapons actually being used? Like, we don't see any explosions. We don't see, like, there's nothing. Like, if we actually had an initiative going on where they were attacking Russia and there was active military action going on in their favor, you would think we would see it. But I've not seen anything.
No. And as George Galloway tweeted just a few weeks ago, he said, I think we mentioned this on the show, but he said, isn't it odd that you can watch more video of World War I than you can of the Ukraine war? That's because there's a media blackout. And as CNN admitted the other day, reporters on the Ukrainian side simply cannot get to the area because Ukrainian special forces, Ukrainian special police will not allow the media to go to those areas.
No, but they can get to Kiev. They're doing pretty, scrubbed up stand-ups in Kiev, holding their microphone, like looking pretty cozy, like they had a shower and they're not in war gear and that kind of thing. Go ahead, David.
I was just going to say, I saw when we said that last week, a lot of people were complaining in the chat saying, yeah, but World War II, they had a lot of time to put the footage together, blah, blah, blah. But if you guys remember Iraq Desert Storm, there was so much footage in real time because they sold the narrative. People bought the narrative and it looked like they were doing what they said they were doing. The reason we don't see it now is because they can't support their narrative at all. If they could, we would see it.
Oh, yeah.
This is Jean Baudrillard word about this, fighting with words and propaganda. Speaking of which, there was a lot of discussion today about this enlisting of military that are either conscripting, yes, active military or the reserves, right? So it's not necessarily a draft, what is happening in Russia. He's saying we are going to call up people who are on reserves and bring them in and actually train them. They're not going straight to the battlefield. And if anyone who has special skills and maybe is retired and would like to enlist, we are taking those conscriptions, I suppose. They said
those reservists, and 300,000 of them.
Yes. So this is 1.5 times what's already there. By all accounts, there are 200,000 who went into this first round of a military offensive in Ukraine. And now, so they're putting 300,000 more. Interesting, though, because a lot of the Western media was sharing this. Do we have this clip here called Flights? This screenshot, The Guardian posted that all flights out of Russia were sold out just hours after this speech because people were worried, I suppose, that they might get drafted into a conflict that, they may not be trained for. I want to point out this is the exact opposite. When the conflict began, Ukraine did not allow people, any human male, to leave the country that was under 65, I believe, or 60, right? That did happen, and they did enlist those people. This is not what's happening in Russia. They are calling up reservists.
And be careful. I mean, enlisting is like it's your choice, right? Conscripting is not your choice.
I apologize for
Yes. But you're right. And so I wanted to check this story because when I see stories like this in Reuters, I immediately question them. They're like, the story was, I don't know, Philip, you want to put it back up there. The story was all of these flights are sold out. Like all of these people are fleeing Russia and all these flights are sold out.
Well, from Google Trends, it says, but go ahead.
So on the website, they specifically talked about aviasales.ru, which is their main sort of discount flight website. And so I checked it. And if you were trying to fly out today, the 21st of September, you could not get a flight. However, you could fly out easily tomorrow. You could fly to London, Dubai. So there was plenty of tickets available. So I wanted to see like every ticket. And I was able to go on booking.com, fly from Moscow, multiple airports in Moscow to London. I checked all of these flights.
So you're going tomorrow.
So I'm going tomorrow. No, but I should point out, like, they're expensive. Like the flights, if you want to leave, because and this is of course where airlines that can rack up the prices. Ethiopian Airlines, Turkish Airlines, like a number of them look like they really surged some prices here to take advantage of people who want to fly and get out. If you booked a one-way ticket,
do you think that has anything to do with sanctions or something? Like, because we're not allowing Russia to fly out to certain places, so I wonder if that's like a premium to allow that or something.
Maybe it is. I mean, maybe because you have to go the long way around it. I'm not sure. One of the flights I looked at, especially in London, was like a chartered flight. So again, yes, you could fly. It's just expensive. But yes, they were sold out today, to be clear.
Now, Joshua Israel in the chat, let me just mention this comment, says that the 300,000 that is being conscripted is for the war with NATO and America, not necessarily the war in Ukraine, which they maybe seem to be kind of handling relatively easily with what they've got.
That's an important point.
Yes, I think it is. And it's one that really sort of stops me in my tracks when you think of that, right?
And that's why I led off this entire block saying that. That was my first sentence in this whole thing, right? Is that they are at war with NATO. And that's what Putin said flat out. And so did his defense secretary this afternoon. Also said the exact same thing. They are at war with NATO now.
And
officially.
He says in this speech that this was approved by the judiciary. So it was voted on. It's not just Putin being a crazy man, right? He took it through his parliament.
Yeah, and Sergei Shoigu, who is the defense minister, said the time has come when we are at war with NATO and the collective West. So, you can try to spin this any way you want. This is what they're seeing. And when they're literally being attacked with NATO weapons, it's hard to deny that that's the case. Although we've been saying that for months, that that's been the case. We are at war anyway.